Good evening, noswaith dda, diolch yn dod. Welcome to the Wales stage at the Hay Festival Winter Weekend. I have a piece of paper to read out here. I think the only important bit of it to remember is to say thank you to those of us watching online, as well as those wonderful people in the hall, and also to remember that these two gentlemen will be signing books after the event. And their names are Tim Marshall, to my left, to your right, and Danny Dorling in the middle. When I studied geography at school, I used to slightly struggle to understand what geography was, since it was a subject so broad that it seemed to encompass almost anything that the teachers found interesting. This is, I think, an event that encapsulates that almost perfectly, since these two books are both geography but could barely cover more different subjects. Danny Dorling's book, Shattered Nation, Inequality and the Geography of a Failing State, is a diagnosis of what's gone wrong with the UK, particularly since inequality began to rise once again in the middle of the 1970s. Sorry. Tim.
Also then.
You did that as well.
It's been a long day. Tim Marshall's The Future of Geography looks outward to space and the prospects of exploring it, how it will work, who will control space, and therefore who will benefit from it. We're going to start with Tim doing a short talk, and then I'm going to ask them some questions, and with about 50 minutes to go, you guys are going to have the chance to ask questions too, so please think of exciting and interesting but short questions to ask while listening to them. Thank you. Tim, take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Oliver. Thanks for the introduction. Great to be here with Danny. I was rubbish at geography at school, never remember any of the dates. And this is a surprise. Didn't know I was going to do this, but apparently someone had sent these nice slides along, which are my slides, and said, we've got these slides, so we said, let's just put the show on right here. So bear with me. My book is about geography, but I write about international relations and space began to dovetail, so I thought, now there's an idea. The books I've written in the past take geography as their foundation, that what happens in the world, Russia, Ukraine, is partially predicated on the geography that it's happening in. And then on that geography, all that history happens partially because of that geography. And then that gives you a better understanding of why stuff is happening right now. So I've taken that template and put it into space where it is a bit more of a stretch. And so I wouldn't say I padded it out, but the hippie in me came out, and I couldn't resist in the opening chapter sort of looking at this great relationship that we have with the cosmos. And I think we all have that relationship deep down, and that mystery. And I take us through that relationship through the ages, through the centuries. Babylonians, the Egyptians who looked at the cycle of the moon and came up with 3 10-day weeks, which is a terrible, terrible idea. Onto the Greeks, which were amazing. Onto Copernicus, which allows a space joke, because you Google space jokes and you scatter them into the book. Thank goodness, when he was a kid, his mum and dad said, Nicholas, the sun doesn't go around you yet, etc. And then I go on to people like this, which I challenge the greatest Russian expert in the room to name.
Andrei Tsiolkovsky.
Yes, it's Lenin. How do you pronounce that?
Tsiolkovsky.
Usual spelling.
My brother wrote a novel about him.
Yeah, I knew that, which is what I know, I just fed in the lines. This guy. 10 years before the Wright brothers took off, this fellow was designing airlocks for space stations to dock with each other. This guy was designing space suits. It was amazing. He'd worked out all sorts of geography of space, which is where I'm going to. And he also came up with the escape velocity, the equation of how fast we need to go for how long until we can actually break the Surly bonds. of Earth, but hardly anyone, apart from those people who have read Oliver Bullough's book, hardly anyone's ever heard of it. Everyone's heard of Kalashnikov, not heard of
Tsiolkovsky.
him. So, and again, then it takes us through people like him, and then on to Einstein, which is my second space joke, or science joke, which is that when he wrote the general theory of relativity in the early part of the last century, a lot of people said, well, it's about time. Thank you. That's it. There's no more. I had better hurry up. I'm sorry. There is a geography to space. This is only a little bit of it. I love low Earth orbit because it's where all the satellites are, so you can download Netflix or whatever. But that is a relatively crowded and getting more crowded area. So there's a geography of just how much you can have there. First come, first served. The bit between low Earth orbit and geosynchronous is about 300 times greater than the area of the Earth. You want to hide something there? You can. The Americans had a space plane up there for 2 years and nobody noticed. Love geosynchronous orbit. It turns at the same speed that the Earth turns, so you can hang a satellite above the same bit of territory all the time. Which is very useful for a whole bunch of things, notably intelligence. The moon, I'll come to briefly. There's a geography of space on Earth. You launch west to east, take advantage of the slingshot effect of the way that the Earth's moving. You hopefully launch with a body of water to your east or a massive desert. And so if you have the ability to do that, you can be a sovereign power that can launch from your own country. There's all that sort of, as close to the equator as possible to get an even faster slingshot. And there's a lot more geography. We then accelerate into the modern day and warfare. This is, for example, what the Russians were doing, and still are, to Elon Musk's Starlink satellite system. They knocked out part of the Ukrainian internet. In flew Musk with thousands and thousands of terminals for his Starlink internet service. Reconnected large parts of Ukraine, got them back up and running. They can organise refugee columns or whatever, but the military, of course, jumped on it and used it to target Russian troops and kill them. Is it, therefore, a legitimate military target? Russia kind of thinks so. They've been dazzling them and spoofing them, sending packets of information. But this is the precursor of what will happen when somebody will try to shoot one down, which has already happened. 4 countries have launched a ballistic missile from the surface of the Earth and knocked one of their own satellites out, blown one of their own satellites out in space. Russia, China, USA and India. Just to test in case they want to do another one of their own satellites and blow it out of space. This again is coming, and lasers, which are now perfected for bringing down drones in warfare, which is the future of drone warfare. The temptation to put one of those on your satellite will be enormous, and if we know the history of humanity, actually the history of mankind, which is better in this particular area, they may not be able to withstand that. Or creates a lot of debris. I'm told this is the biggest problem of all up in space, the amount of debris there is, and the amount of work. There's a lot of work going into getting rid of it. And finally, almost to the politics, we're going up as blocks, American-led bloc. The Americans, with the Artemis Accord signatures, including the UK, intend to have a man and a woman walking on the surface of the moon in 2026, probably in HD and colour. So those of us that are old enough to have watched it first time round, which includes myself, it'll be even better this time. Slight problem. Well, one of the reasons they're going up is to mine the moon. There's a whole bunch of reasons to be there: military, commercial, and science. One of the problems with the Artemis Accords is it talks about if you've made it all the way there and made all that, invested all that money in mining, you can declare a safety zone. That's appropriation, that's sovereignty, that's colonization, whereas it's supposed to be the global or space commons for all humanity. That is fraying very quickly. The Chinese are going up with Russia as their junior partner. They intend to have a moon base early 2030s, as do the Americans. But it reflects the politics of Earth. Probably saw the Indians got there to the lunar South Pole this summer. Any fool can land in the Sea of Tranquility, like the Americans did. It's flat. To land at the lunar South Pole is quite something, but that's where the water is. From water you have hydrogen and oxygen, rocket fuel. That's where the titanium is, that's where the iron is, that's where the silicon is, and lithium is there, many of the other things we need for sustainability in the 21st century. So it's all systems go. It's a new time, there's new manners of warfare. It's deeply, deeply political and commercial, and essentially I think we're going to see a repeat of all the mistakes we've done here.
Thank you, Tim. I think it is easy, considering all the horrible things that are happening on Earth right now, to think, well, space can wait. But I think one of the parallels that you make in the book, which is particularly good, is the parallel between space and the oceans in a previous age. That whoever controlled the oceans controlled the Earth, and now whoever controls space controls what's happening here. Now, there are, and as I was explaining to these two gentlemen just now, there are some really interesting parallels between these two books, which I'm looking forward to digging out. I'm looking forward to surprising them with. But Danny, just to make sure that everyone knows where you're coming from, in your book you say Britain is showing all the classic signs of a failing state. Now, I was under the impression after listening to Jeremy Hunt yesterday that everything was fine. So could you briefly explain where he was going wrong?
Briefly, let's try. So the crucial thing is the word failing, right? Not failed, long way away from a failed state. There are a few failed states, it's truly awful. Failing, you can do it in Jeremy Hunt's own terms, which is rankings. For somebody like Jeremy, I think son of an admiral, what matters is the place of Britain in the world, where we rank first, second or third. Very good for Olympic medals, particularly at sitting down sports, but on things that really matter, we're less good. That's depressing if we do this too long. So start with children, which is always the saddest. There are about 5 countries in Eastern Europe which have a worse neonatal mortality rate than us. Otherwise, we have the worst mortality rate of children in the first 4 weeks of life in Europe, apart from the poorest places. The heights of our children are now falling, according to research published in The Lancet. They're not falling in Germany, they're not falling in other parts of Europe, they're not falling because of immigration, they're falling because of lack of decent nutrition. And the fall began in 2005. So this isn't just a pop at the coalition government or the Tories. New Labour were in power when the fall in heights began. And he's going to check if I can go on. And it gets depressing. The US, by the way, has had a fall as well. If you want a sort of saving grace for these statistics, it's almost always worse in the US than what I'm describing here. But not anywhere else in Europe. Life expectancy, bigger falls than anywhere else in Europe, began about 2012 with austerity, with women aged over 65, just 2 weeks at the start of that. Life expectancy in 2014 was higher than 2015, 16, 17 and 18 for both men and women. Very briefly in 2019 we had a good year, slightly better than 2014, and then of course we had a pandemic, which on the face of it we didn't appear to have that significantly worse mortality level than some other countries in Europe, except we'd already had so many elderly people die early that they weren't around to die from COVID. I could do homelessness, I could do prisons, I could do expulsions from schools, or I could give you, let me just do a tiny bit of good news, or we could look at Scotland, which isn't perfect, but in Scotland you can literally count the number of children permanently expelled from school with 2 hands, and in a good year of 1 hand. The Scottish government, during the pandemic, had a COBRA committee, the same as the one in Westminster. You might remember Nicola standing there looking like she took every death personally. There was a difference between Nicola Sturgeon and those deaths and what was going on in London, as is now being revealed. When the cost of living crisis began, she convened COBRA again to deal with the cost of living crisis, because it is just as serious, if not more serious, in terms of health effects than a pandemic. They did various things, including preventing people from being evicted from their homes when they couldn't pay their rent, because the rents are going up and their incomes aren't. We are in the longest cost of living crisis, fall of living standards, as measured by the Bank of England, since 1798. It took until 1822 for wages to return to their 1798 levels. We're well past every depression that's happened. What did Nicola do to end up on the what can you do question? They introduced a little Scottish child payment, which began at £10 a week for any child under 6 in any family receiving any kind of benefit. By November of last year, it had been increased to £25 a week for all children aged under 16 living in Scotland for any family receiving any form of benefit. That's 2 out of 7 children. It's untapered. You just get the money. You don't have other benefits reduced because you get it. For a family of 3 in Scotland, that's £3,900 by now, a year. £3,900 means that no child in Scotland need go cold or hungry. In England, the majority of children with a brother and sister, 56%, are going seriously hungry 3 or 4 times a month. Majority. Because, of course, we don't give child benefit to the third child, and that's just what it takes. So, it's awful, but when people say you can't do anything, it's already happening in parts of the UK. It's entirely possible. And you can look across the mainland of Europe to see things that are much, much more imaginative than what we do. But Hunt tells us that his way is the only way, that it'll result in the sunlit uplands coming just around the corner. It'll release business and our true English entrepreneurial spirit. Because if you don't have taxes low, even though of course our taxes are high historically, then the economy will do terribly. But the taxes are higher in Italy, and Spain, and Germany, and France, and Belgium, and the Netherlands, and Sweden, and every other major country in Europe apart from Switzerland and Ireland, where they look low because they have pharmaceutical industries and American headquarters that distort their GDP figures. So we have low taxes, low public spending. Jeremy Hunt, I honestly think, doesn't understand this. I don't think he gets it. He believes what he believed at 16 and 18, what he was taught in his school, what his friends have believed. He thinks he's doing a good job. There is no doubt there. And when Nick Robinson, if you heard him this morning on the Today Show, interviews him, it's not really an interview. It really isn't. Because Nick is there agreeing with Jeremy. I listen to the Today Show programme avidly because if you really want to hear, and it's in the book in chapter 8, so I'm not just... if you want to hear the internal thinking of the Conservative Party, listen to the Today Show. There are different kinds of Conservatives, different nuances of opinion, but essentially that is where we are at in a failing state, where your media is ranked at the bottom out of 26 comparisons in Europe, where you don't get a decent public debate about what's going on, where nobody gives you the comparisons and says, what is it that they do in Germany? How do they deal with these issues in other countries? And if it can work there, what is it about England in particular that means that we can't do any of that? Why do our children have to be getting shorter?
You may at this point be wondering how I'm going to stitch these two books together. The mid-1970s is a crucial time for your book. As you say, social indicators peaked around 1974 and started to decline around 1976. Could you briefly, I think that probably goes against a lot of people's opinion of the 1970s. Certainly the stereotype of the 1970s is a time of decline and mutual discontent and 3-day week and all that. Can you very briefly explain how we were all wrong about the 70s.
Dominic Sandbrook and the libeling of a decade. It's the shortest version. Young men who weren't even alive there writing a story. It was bad if you had lots of money because of inflation ate up wealth. But wages on average went up more than inflation most year in the 70s. There are enough people I can see in the audience. I can only see the first 4 rows, so I'm sure it's school children all behind. But you will remember being able to start a home in your 20s, get a mortgage, you'll rent securely. You'll remember being able to get your first job. You'll remember, some of you, not liking that job, and because there was full employment, you could tell your boss to shove it and get another job. You will remember things improving all the time. You may remember, if you're like me, that we desegregated our schools in the 60s. And so that if you were a parent of children in the 70s, your children could go to school with other children for the first time in our history. If you measure it, things got better. What was getting better too slowly, in particular, was the position of women, but it was getting better because women were fighting for it. And what was most terrible about the 70s was racism, which was getting worse. And we weren't very tolerant if you were not heterosexual either. So it's not perfect. But for the majority of people, and for the crucial thing, which is how much money you're paid in relation to other people, which essentially is how much we think you're worth, it had never in the history of the UK been as equal as it was in the 70s. You were not looked down on as dirt by how much you were paid, and we didn't look up at other people and go, oh, they're worth £4 million a year because they're the chief executive officer of a FTSE 100 company. We didn't pay them. You know who we paid the most in the 70s? Doctors. We paid doctors more than bankers because we thought that they were more worthwhile as people because of what they did. My childhood in the 70s, there was only one large European country which was more equitable than we were, and that was Sweden. Right? So I grew up in a Scandinavian Nordic country called England at a time, and this is from the measurements of it. Sheffield had a higher life expectancy than the UK as a whole. That's why the full Monty and Brastoff hits home so much. People lived for longer in Sheffield than the average length of life in England. It has to be brief, so I promise I will. For a few years in the 70s, and the only years in the whole of the last century, the population of the centre of the country moved north. Right? In really bad times, it shoots south. In the 1930s, people got on their bike. In the 1980s, it shot down. But in a few years in the wonderful 1970s, and we had ABBA, Waterloo, Honey, Chopper Bikes. You know, I can play Dominic Sandbrook on this. A few years in the 70s.
Golden age of Welsh rugby.
Yep. And you know, and it wasn't that long since we won a World Cup. But it moved north. So it's when you measure it, and the Tories hated it. So they vilify and create a false history of the 70s because it was their worst decade, except for what happened at the end of it.
So, you said people didn't look up to anyone in the 70s, but they literally, this is where the link comes, they literally looked up to people on the moon.
Yes.
No, I think this is really interesting because this isn't only a British or English story about equality in the late 60s, early 70s. That's the
US was,
peak period in the US. It was also a golden time in many European countries, but it's also the golden period of the space race. Right? So they seem to be. It's interesting that at a time when so much money was being spent on social programs, also so much money was being spent on putting people on the moon. So what was going on with that? Why was that considered a priority at a time when there was also a priority, particularly in the US, for the Great Society, for the Lyndon Johnson years?
That starts in the 60s, and it's ideological, deeply ideological. The Americans and the Russians each have to prove that their society is the superior one, that their education system, their universities, their scientists, their technology, their drive, their ambition, and that's why they both spent so much money. And it was the Russians were winning and winning and winning, and then Kennedy came along and said, "That's it. Let's throw everything we've got at this." And he actually spelt it out as a from the speech of his, not the well-known one, but a much less known one, which he actually spells it out and says, as you know, humanity is a fork in the road, and people are wondering which fork to choose, and that's why we have to get to the moon first. So of course all the money was thrown at it, and we're talking about the same decade as Martin Luther King assassinated, the Vietnam War, the Kent State University shootings, the Watts riots, etc., etc. And a very strong argument why we're wasting all this money. Well, it was ideological. Now, and they went to the moon, they won it, they brought back some rocks, and then they went again and brought back some rocks. And they kept going out and bringing back some rocks until Nixon said, "Enough rocks," pulled the plug. There's a commercial rationale, there's a profit rationale of going back for mining, and there's a military rationale, and there's a scientific rationale. And the same argument resurfaces, why we're spending all this money. I think the answer in the 60s and 70s was to prove who's best. Ideologically and just to have a bit of chest thumping. The difference this time is it's not really ideological, it's far more commercial. So that was the rationale why we're spending money then. Now the rationale is we're going to spend a lot of money, we're going to speculate to accumulate. It's a very, very different rationale, but that is the explanation now.
Though, I mean, it's interesting you say it's not ideological, because obviously it is commercial, but you don't have to look too far to think that there is an ideology built into that, in that the wealth that someone like Elon Musk has, or someone like Jeff Bezos, or even in our own British crap away, Richard Branson, that they have so much money that they're able to go to space, or very near space in the case of Richard Branson. We are sorry Branson fans. It is an expression of inequality. The fact that these people are able to, Jeff Bezos appears to be just doing this for the fun. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a little harsh. Bezos has got a team working on space cities for 300 years' time. With the concept, you don't plant a tree to sit in its shade, you plant a tree for your grandchildren to sit in the shade. So he's not entirely negative or bad, but no, you are right. There is a lot of chest thumping. The inequality in America, I think, is even greater than ours, and the disparity of what people are paid. Yes, that's all there, but I'm not sure about the ideology. We, the Americans, are not trying to prove that their ideological system is superior to the Chinese. There is a bit of which is the more powerful nation, but it's not ideologically driven. I think that's one of the two biggest changes are, I don't think it's ideological now, and the amount of private enterprise that is front and centre in the American drive, and indeed in the Chinese drive. They've got so many private companies. And let's face it, China is not a communist country. It's ruled by the Communist Party, but it's a capitalist country ruled by communists. So they have a military-civil fusion, and basically both sides are betting big that the winner this time is the one that wins the spoils that are to be gained. Not bragging rights, but the actual, I'm going to dig up this lithium and sell it to you for a huge profit and use it for my car industry.
The man is going to say.
We probably differ, although you know more about the detail. In a way, the 1960 space race, famously this was putting Whitey on the moon at the time.
I was going to quote Gil
Sorry.
Scott-Heron. Those who don't know the Gil Scott-Heron
you got to sing it now.
Prose poem, where he doesn't even sing it, is no hot water, no toilet, no lights, but Whitey's on the moon. How come I ain't got no money here? Whitey's on the moon.
Yeah.
There was at the time a feeling that this space race was not for everyone.
Oh yeah, and the feeling of unfairness. But on the other hand, the normal way in which you compete when you're hegemonic superpowers is you actually fight each other. So having a fight and showing off as men, but wasting a lot of money, but not actually killing each other was a massive form of advancement on a century earlier. On what we used to do. They could have done something far better than going to the moon, right? They could have turned the USA into a kind of utopia to make the Nordic countries look bad, but it's far better. It's far better than a war would have been. This time, I think there is an ideology, and it's a similar ideology to the kind of ideology that billionaires sponsor. Billionaires sponsor particular think tanks to tell us particular things about how the world should work, and you'll be familiar with those think tanks. It's generally kind of, be careful who I say, when they're all dead you can name them. But it's basically the market is the best thing you can do, let it run free, you're all going to be rich, trickle down works, and they fund the think tanks, and the think tanks tell you that. Now they've got a problem, because it's becoming obvious that we can't carry on doing that for what will happen to the planet, right? Except if you could get up to the moon and wreck that, which hardly matters because nobody lives there to get the things you need, or ideally get to Mars, you can carry on expanding. You can have a model, an economic model that says that every year must be 2% or 3% bigger than the year before, which has been the model for 400 years, but starting in Amsterdam small and getting larger to take over the planet. If that's your model, how can you continue it? You continue it by going out into space, eventually colonising other planets. You don't have to stop it. We're currently predicted to stop around about 9 or 10 billion people in the year 2086 by the UN. For the first time in the history of the species, we're not going to expand. If you don't like that idea, and you're entrepreneurial, like the royal families of Portugal and Spain were, you send ships out to find a new world. And it's ambitious, but it's an ideology. It's that business and expansion and growth is good, and we mustn't limit our expectations, and the future will be far better if we do this. And you can see I'm sceptical, because I can work out how long it takes to get to Mars. Okay, it could be robots, you could have a really long-term plan where 30 years later stuff arrives. I mean, alternatively, you could actually try to work out, can 10 or 9 or 8 billion of us live on just this one rock in a way that didn't wreck it without having to go and find other ones?
I have a counter.
Go on.
But of course I would.
Yeah,
Sorry, Oliver.
I'm glad you do, because there is a concern I had reading your book, is that space becomes a new form of offshore.
It is, yes.
You know, the people I've mentioned, none of them are huge enthusiasts for paying tax. And, you know, they'd previously used the Cayman Islands, the Virgin Islands and so on. If you can use the moon, all the better.
You've got London.
Yeah, or London. Yeah, I mean,
especially London.
Especially, yeah. So I mean, but by all means, I'm interested in the counter to that, because you say in the book every human on Earth has a stake in a rules-based space order, which is obviously true, particularly with all the.
Yeah, we don't have a rules-based space order. We need one.
But so I suppose the question is, you know, who makes the rules?
Yeah, usually the winner. And who writes it? Right, going back, I think this constant expansion began a very, very long time before, 400 years ago. The Roman Empire, for example, the Abyssinian Empire, the Mali Empire. We've always expanded. Exploration is part of it. We have always done that, and we will never stop. Even if you're right, and you might be, your vision of it would not succeed. Even if you're right, even if your solutions were the best, they still won't, because of the human spirit, the negative and positive sides of it, because there are negative and positive from going out. So the counter is myriad. One, all the many scientific advances from the space race, I think, may help us. And I'm not talking about those big metal things they put around people at the end of marathons, which came from the space race. Yeah, we could do without those, I accept that. Laptop computers, for better or worse, but we are now more connected. There are myriad examples. The medical experiments that you can only do in space, and without the space race you don't have these medical experiments. They are enormous, and they are doing enormous amounts of good for people, and they're going to save lots and lots of people's lives, growing human tissue in space you can't do on Earth in gravity. The very materials we need for renewable energy. I would much rather wreck the moon than continue wrecking here. We won't even be able to see it. We need that stuff up there.
We're going to bet the dark side.
There is no dark side. Pink Floyd got that completely wrong.
Oh, we're picking all the enemies today.
The very materials we need are up there. Now, whether the economic modelling is correct or not, I don't know, but we need that stuff to make our renewable energy here. We also need Planet B, precisely because we're wrecking this one. We also, without a space race, would not have been able to do what we did last year, which was fire essentially a large fridge freezer-sized piece of metal 3 million miles and deflect an asteroid as an experiment. And we've knocked it off course. It wasn't going to hit us. But without those scientific advantages, we're not going to be able to have a Planet B and to be able to hopefully save ourselves. Without the satellites, we would not be able to tell people this is where the hurricane is going to land. If you want to save thousands and thousands of lives, move. This is where the ocean temperatures are warmer, because we measure them with the satellites. It helps us to understand climate change. The economies in Africa, many African countries are now making their own small CubeSats. They put them up in their constellations, and it allows them to tell small-scale farmers, that's where you should plant. This is the best area, because arable land is one of the most important things in the African continent. It also allows them, they're trying to unify their economies. This is where you put your rail links, and this is where you put your road links, because before you were doing that, the satellites and they're knitting together economies to try to help the economy standards of living. There are myriad reasons, but the main reason I think your view won't work is that it is human to go, and we always will.
It's male.
Why is a woman going to be on the moon in 2026 then?
Because a man said she should.
Yeah.
She doesn't want to go?
I don't want to get too far into,
We
particularly
with
There's
female
something,
space.
something in what you say.
Yeah.
particularly since someone may point out that we are currently sitting on a man.
Yes.
Before we get time to questions, Danny, in the book, your book, you call for planned progressive change to rebuild the state of Britain, and I mean, I think by extension, the state of many other countries, which have analogous, if not necessarily as serious problems as we have. But in a time when billionaires are so rich that they can afford their own space rockets, it's not just super yachts anymore. Who needs a super yacht? How do you force through planned progressive change against people with that kind of resources?
And that kind of resources to influence politics.
Well, yeah.
Because they hate the fact you've all got one vote.
Also, we've seen Bond films. We know what they do with their rockets anyway.
There's a lot of hope in this. So there's hope that we've had such a massive acceleration in education in the world, allowing people to go to school. Huge numbers. About a third of the planet now go to university of some kind. The idea that you're going to be able to fool all these people and tell them they don't understand and they don't know enough, I think will be hard. There are very different opinions between the young and the old on many of these things. And there are different stories. I can tell a story about the British laptop, which was made with government money by the BBC, had nothing to do with space. It's perfectly fine to be doing experiments up in space and to be doing science. But the minute you have people trying to make a lot of money out of it, you're in trouble. My first geography department where I taught in was in Bristol. And we had a very advanced remote sensing centre there, and they got some money from outside. And it took me a year or so to work out there was a satellite over the Atlantic which could see the crops growing in Brazil and the crops growing in West Africa. And so knew before anybody else which were growing the better for when you're shorting on the markets. Yeah. So the danger of thinking that entrepreneurs are going to do good with this stuff, the ones who make all the big money, are not. it has almost always been the state that has been involved with science and universities in making innovations, just as it was in the 60s with the space race. There are lots of private companies involved, but essentially on both sides it was the state doing that. But I'm not against going up into space. I'm certainly not against satellites, which are wonderful. It's impossible now to turn off the cameras anywhere in the world as long as Elon allows you to broadcast through his satellites. You can't actually deny the internet to anyone, which really matters at the moment. And it's an irony, we never thought it would be Elon doing that. But the danger of thinking that this is going to allow the program to continue, and this is where we'll disagree, although I'm a hippie. The ones which were expansionist and had bravado left monuments. They left the Colosseum, they left giant arches, they left pyramids. All the civilizations which were much more sustainable and often lasted for longer leave far fewer monuments, but they are there. These former ones, of course, collapsed and got smaller. We had very, very slow global population growth until about 1820. And then you get this incredible acceleration, which involved us above all else. 2 prime ministers have now quoted that we invaded 90% of the current members of the United Nations uninvited at one or other point in our history. That had the effect of disrupting stable social systems, right? Villages, ways of living. Think of Australia, and resulted in a population explosion around the world. Because that's what happens if you invade and take over and ramp up slavery and take opium to China with your battleships demanding the free trade right to sell your opium in China. So this expansion has certainly happened, but the big acceleration was from 1820, and it ended the acceleration in the year 1968. When the population bomb book was written, the growth rate of human beings was 2.1%, never hit 2.1% before. It's now well below 1%, and it's set to go to 0% in 2086 according to the current UN projections, which every 2 years it becomes nearer and nearer, because the average woman in the world wants half a baby less than the average man, and the woman is getting to choose and decide. And 100 years ago, women were not seen as human. Right? This is the biggest revolution that's occurred on the planet, is the changing social position of women. And it's not that we're that binary, but the expansion was partly the assertion of men getting in charge in these empires and so on. The end of this is a different changing in attitudes about who we are, and controlling a minority of human beings who are disproportionately male. Look at the Forbes billionaires list. Right? You have to go a long way down. And controlling the greedy. And we're still learning how to control the greedy, and controlling their machines that they create to make themselves look good, because they want to look good. And it's almost not their fault they're greedy. You have to have that drive, possibly that testosterone or whatever else it was. Often has been documented a tragedy in childhood. Things had to go badly wrong to want, but then for a brief amount of time, for a couple of decades or a lifetime, you're the man. But then it all goes, and there's another one. But we have to control it because it's incredibly wrecking. It isn't considered over what we do. It doesn't result in us having a good information service, a good press, because some of them decide they want to own our newspapers. And you talk to almost everybody in those newspapers, almost to the top, and their politics is completely different from the paper that employs them. It doesn't result in good decisions about where you put your money and industry, about how you feed the planet in future, what people actually need and want. It does result in these super yachts and an entire industry around the super yachts, and the idea that it's fine to have servants again and to move towards that. Because going back to the 60s and the space race, at the same time, as we were doing that Brave New Future, which wasn't about killing people, that's what I like about the space race, at the same time we were doing a Lady Chatterley's Trial, Lover. Is this a book you'd want your wife and servants to read? It was a time of incredible social progress.
Danny, we're going to open up to our own form of democracy.
Go on.
Can we have the lights up, please? There are 2 roving microphones. I sincerely hope that I have to say I could listen to these 2 for 4 hours. I would love to have questions from you guys. So hands up, please. Otherwise, we're just going to continue our jousting match. Yes, there is a hand up over there. Is that working?
Is the Antarctic Treaty a model for regulating space exploration? I don't know much about it, but is it it's always touted as working perfectly, and is that some way that we could translate that to moon exploration?
I think it's a good example. As you think of the Antarctic as a pizza, there should be, if anybody should have claims on it, if you had it like 6 different pieces, but there's about 13 countries that have a claim on it, and so there are these overlapping claims. But what they have always agreed is that we're not going to touch it. It's just dormant. We've all signed the treaty. We're not going to explore it. We're not going to drill on it. We're not going to try and find fossil fuels. And against many expectations, it's held, and it is still holding. And it is one of the great examples of cooperation and acceptance that we need to keep this pristine. So yes, but I think a better template is UNCLOS, United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea. The UN's laws of the sea are signed by about 130 countries, and they are the sort of rules of the road, how we should operate. And I think we need to take something like the Antarctic Treaty and United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which is completely out of date and is not fit for purpose because it's a jungle now in space, because we lack the laws which are fit for the 21st century, and put them together so we don't have a shooting match there, and we don't have colonisation there, and it remains the global commons. But at the moment, it's the Wild West.
Yeah, I do agree on this. It's a sorting out.
Really?
I know. I will, well, not necessarily on what the agreement will be, but we need it. We need it. You cannot just let this carry on as it is. This is the worrying thing. Right? We have no idea if we can get on with each other and organise with this number of people. You can look at the history of the UN. It's relatively recent. You're only looking at a few decades of the League of Nations before. The UN is not in a happy state at the moment. Something like the World Health Organization being degraded for the first time in its history. But if we do not organise collectively, and we also have to look at the criticisms. My favourite criticism of the Law of the Sea is Guy Standing's book, the Blue Planet, and about the commons and the sea, and the incredible damage being done by industrial fishing and so on. So we haven't got the sea worked out. It's kind of lucky that there aren't diamonds worth too much or something else in the Antarctic. I do worry.
Yeah. If they find something there, it'll be tested, this treaty.
Yeah, and people will ask, how come these countries from the opposite side of the planet have a right to such a slice of this place?
Don't we have like half?
Britain's an Arctic country.
Yeah.
We're a Pacific country as well, because we're joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Yeah, but you have to come to an agreement. And this is where it gets most interesting. I remember we were once asked to draw a world map of how many votes different countries got in a trade body. And we were asked by we did a thing called World Mapper, we draw lots of maps. And the African delegation, this was like The Girl in the Cafe. Do you remember that movie? No. So the African delegation said, please can those little geographers in the University of Sheffield draw a map to show how unfair it is that Africa gets so few votes. And the US has such high votes but doesn't have that many people. And so we drew the map which showed this of the world, and then they changed the number of votes in this particular UN body, and China and India got more, but Africa didn't because it's poor. But we've got to change the way in which we value human beings internationally, so that just because you come from a poor country doesn't mean that you have 1,000 times fewer votes than somebody from a rich country. And the attitudes in the rest of the world are changing. People are not impressed by the UK anymore in the way that they were. And if you look at the international criticism of the United States, it has risen and risen and risen. Now we're going to get angry and bitter about this. We're going to go, why don't they understand that we have all the answers? Why is the rest of the world not realising our superior intellectual ability? Why are they condemning what? It's not just UK and USA, but we're the largest partners in these things, with a set of other countries kind of latching on for some favour. We're going to get angry and bitter and maybe a little bit dangerous, but our place is sinking in the world, right? You don't always stay being number one. This idea that you're going to get back to the sunlit uplands is just around the corner. That doesn't work. George Osborne promised it in 2015. If you follow my economic plan, we'll be the richest large country in the world by per capita GDP by 2030. He sent Matt Hancock out to send the message, which you can already tell. Boris Johnson's resignation speech includes that if you follow the path...
Let's not
mention Boris.
No.
Keir Starmer. To be fair, Keir. Okay, but Keir promises this, and Hunt today.
Oh, God.
Yeah, it's all these men telling us, if we just do what we want, we'll be at our rightful place again. And of course, for the USA, it's USA number one. We're coming down, and coming down is going to be difficult. And we're going to have to work harder on getting on with other people so that we can make these treaties that are fair, not ones where it's written, and oh, by the way, that hemisphere space is going to be ours, and the rest of 95% of humanity, you can have the other bit.
But on that, all right, Tim, I think that's brilliant. But in a world when only 3 or 4 countries have got rockets, right, the rest of the countries can say as much as they like.
Yep.
We want equal rights, and so good luck.
Go all the way back to the Roman Empire.
Go out there and claim them.
Yeah, this is what I meant about first come, first served. It'd be extraordinarily difficult for many countries to catch up, and so the people that are there now will be the ones that, if there are riches to be had, they will be the ones that will benefit from it. And I concur with everything, nearly everything you just said. I mean, if you look at Russia-Ukraine, the global south sees it as a European civil war. What's it got to do with us? Why are you asking us to get involved? And I think many things about the Ukraine-Russia war, but I do understand that attitude.
Yeah, a friend of mine just pointed out what's happening in Ethiopia at the moment and asking why we're not quite so...
And Eritrea.
Yeah. On that depressing note,
So
yes, there is a hand up just over there. Yes, sorry, we went on a bit long.
The expansion talked about 400 years ago, or longer, where we were always expanding around the world. That's different because lots of people didn't have a say, but also it's in this country, or in this world, that this expansion to space is such a big leap. Don't you think there should be more direct democracy or some sort of people say in where our tax money goes? Why should we be spending on this when we've got so many problems here? Don't you think they're taking that Birkin role a bit too far, taking us up there when we've got things to sort out here?
Okay, I mean, the interesting thing, I do agree, but you can guess my politics on but things like how they decided about abortion in Ireland. That's a masterclass in how you get a set of people to talk about what you're doing and how to achieve it. I mean, the irony is that we're not in the UK. One spaceport somewhere, the University of Leicester, but what is our space program? And this point I'm trying to make of the future is not going to be the UK or the USA. And will not be dominated by these European powers, and it was the United Provinces before us, with a particular way of thinking, all dominated by the Protestant Church until Kennedy, which was things were changing, and that changes. So you're right. We need to find a way of involving more people in these decisions. But in terms of these two countries, the UK and the USA, the first thing we need is actually a form of democracy. Because we still have a House of Lords, we have an undemocratic voting system. The USA has the Senate, right? Which 2 senators from a state, no matter what its population is. Right? These two countries are some of the most undemocratic countries in terms of voting system. Before you even get to your deliberative democracy, they need democracy. We have bishops in the House of Lords.
Lord David Cameron agrees with you, I think.
Dave is on that.
Call me Lord Dave.
I'm thinking about more democracy, but I mean, your question is wider, and it's about, well, are we going to have a little referendum on how much we're going to spend on this and this and this and this and this? I mean, that's not the way any society really is organised. Closest to get to is probably Switzerland. On the wider issue, and they only have a referendum once every 5 years about whether you can have a washing machine in your basement or something. On the wider issue, this is what I'll go back to the thing about the treaties, because I think that is the most urgent message I've got in this book, in that we absolutely need to rewrite the rules and enshrine it that whatever we do benefit from is actually shared out. And that's why I mentioned that when I said about the Artemis Accords, this Article 11 talking about creating safety zones. And when you look into the details of it, you can declare the safety zone pretty much as big an area as you want on the moon, and for as long as you want. And then it says, but we will be quite transparent about it. And then it says in brackets, unless there are commercial sensitivities. That's what I meant about repeating our mistakes. So, Danny and I think, probably fundamentally disagree on basics. No, actually, we probably agree on basics. We fundamentally disagree on detail. But if we're going to find common ground, is that unless we work out a way of sharing, we're screwed.
Actually, I was going to say, I think you both do agree on the fact that if we don't sort out the ground rules...
Don't hate me. I actually am a capitalist. I think it is... I want capitalism with a human face, and I don't think we have capitalism with a human face.
Yeah.
I'm not sure Danny is a capitalist.
I'm not a capitalist. I'm a utopian.
Yes.
I
want to be a utopian, but I'm too unpleasant.
So no, you're not unpleasant. I'm ridiculously egotistical. So I wrote a book before this called Slow Down, which claims that capitalism isn't here forever. It's a thing. It's a change. It's all about 2-3% growth. It's a process that began on the dockside of Amsterdam. In my story, René Descartes said, all around me is madness, men are just gone mad by the sight of money. Amsterdam had half the wealth of Europe going through it. And this thing exploded, that you could do this, behave in this way, lend money, get interest, get more, go out and explore. It looks great. And it worked until you ran out of planet, right? And then that wasn't the end, because as long as people are having lots of babies and the population is increasing, you can sell more shirts. But then they stopped having babies. 1990 was peak baby in the world. And it doesn't work anymore, because you can't make a profit when you can't carry on expanding to greater markets. And it's even worse when you lot begin to get savvy and go, actually, do I really need to buy that for Christmas? And then you're in trouble. That's the short... Capitalism will not last forever. No human system does. The question is how this one is going to end. Is it going to end in a great disaster like the Roman Empire at the end of it and many of the other expanding systems that we had in the past? Or will we work out a way to gently go down, as we are with children, the numbers that we're having, and get our way out of this? Now, I don't care too much, and I'm not that anxious about what we get to. I just don't think we're going to have this in 100 or 200 or 300 years' time, because the other planets aren't near enough. They're not there.
When they said...
You said Jupiter there.
No, when they said come to Hay and talk to Danny Dyer about it, I thought, what? And then I realised my big mistake. It's Danny Dorling.
Which brings us back to David Cameron. Anyway, my clock has gone red.
We started 2 minutes late.
Well, in that case, I'm going to say, I think that there is a a deep agreement between the two of you, which the lesson I got from your book, and tell me if I'm wrong, is that if we don't get the ground rules about space right, we're going to repeat the mistakes up there that we've been making down here. And I think that's what you were saying as well.
Yeah, we need walls.
It's common ground. Yes, we're already doing it, and there's the militarisation of space going on. And all right, for the last time, we need a treaty which encompasses space debris. We need a global body which everybody says this is what we know about where space debris is. This is how to clean it up, and we need it enshrined that if we can crack things like solar energy from fields of solar panels in space, again, the economic modelling is not there, but if we can, because it's 24 hours a day sunlight up there, very powerful sunlight, but we can direct it to anywhere you want in Earth, we've got to put it in the treaties that we will share that clean energy out. That's the sort of thing that the 21st century treaty needs to start looking at, because the 20th century treaties are no good.
Thank you for coming. They'll be signing books outside, and please come to lots of other events with or without these two gentlemen. Thank you.